There is a moment in the life of Saint Teresa of Avila so rarely spoken of, so quietly buried within her writings, that many never realize its power. It was not one of her dramatic ecstasies, nor one of the visions that left her trembling on the chapel floor. It was something far more subtle, yet far more devastating. It came in the silence where only God speaks, in that interior chamber of her soul, where Christ often drew her into a dialogue deeper than words. Teresa had grown familiar with the presence of Christ, his tenderness, his warmth, his gentle reproaches that always carried a sweetness. But on this day, something felt different. She entered prayer as she always did, expecting consolation or instruction, but instead she felt a heaviness, as though the air around her soul had thickened. Her heart became still, her thoughts quieted, and she sensed Christ approaching, not with comforting light, but with a solemnity that made her breath catch in her throat. She later wrote that there was a sorrow in him deeper than the ocean, a sorrow that did not belong to the earthly emotions she knew. It was something eternal, something vast, an anguish rooted not in his own suffering, but in the wounds humanity inflicts upon itself. Then Christ appeared, not in the radiant glory she had once seen, nor in the compassionate gentleness that melted every resistance in her soul. He appeared with a gravity she had never witnessed. His eyes, those eyes that once seemed to hold all of heaven, now reflected a grief that seemed to stretch across eternity. His expression was not wrath. It was heartbreak. Teresa felt her entire being tremble under his gaze. She felt exposed, vulnerable, known. And in that piercing silence, before a single word was spoken, she understood that something in the human heart had deeply offended divine love. When Christ finally spoke, his voice was not loud. It did not echo through the chambers of her spirit. It was soft, soft in the way truth becomes when it is too painful to speak. And yet, she said, it struck her more violently than thunder, more sharply than a sword. "Daughter," he said, "the soul that refuses to forgive binds itself." Teresa felt those words enter her like a burning light. Christ continued, "Mercy cannot enter where hatred remains, and the moment such a soul stands before me, it cannot bear my presence." She froze. This was no poetic teaching, no gentle theological lesson. It was a revelation of eternal reality, spoken from the very one who sees the deepest movements of every soul. Teresa had been shown visions of hell before. She had seen the torments of demons, the flames that never rest. Yet she writes that nothing terrified her as much as the sorrow in Christ's voice at that moment. It was as though she was looking into the heart of God and seeing a wound, not inflicted by sin alone, but by the refusal of souls to let go of sin. Christ was not warning her about the offenses committed against him. He was grieving the self-inflicted destruction humans cause when they choose bitterness over mercy. As he spoke, Teresa suddenly felt a clarity about her own heart, clarity she had never wanted. She saw her pride. She saw the grudges she had quietly stored away. She saw the memories of wounds she held onto because they made her feel justified. She saw how quickly she had closed her heart when she felt misunderstood or mistreated. In Christ's sorrow, she recognized herself. But the most terrifying moment was not the words, nor the realization of her own faults. It was what Christ allowed her to feel next. He allowed her to sense, just for an instant, what a soul experiences when it stands before perfect love while still clutching bitterness. She felt a tightening around her heart, a pressure, a suffocating weight that made her gasp. It was as though her soul was being pulled in two directions, one toward God's overwhelming love, and the other toward the resentment she refused to release. She understood instantly. Unforgiveness is not merely an emotion. It is not simply a decision to withhold kindness. It is a chain, one that coils around the soul, link by link, every time we refuse mercy. And in the moment of death, when the soul is drawn toward God, that chain becomes unbearable. It is the soul itself, Christ told her, that creates the weight it cannot escape. Teresa began to weep, not because she feared punishment, not because she feared Christ's judgment, but because, in that terrifying moment of divine truth, she realized how easily a soul can condemn itself without ever realizing it. This revelation shattered her. It broke her heart in a way no vision of hell ever had. For she understood now that the greatest danger is not always found in external temptations, demons, or worldly evils. The greatest danger is the hardening of the heart. And Christ was not finished. What he revealed next would be even more dreadful, something that would leave Teresa trembling every time she thought of the moment of death. Teresa says that Christ, in his infinite mercy, opened before her a sight she never asked to see. She did not prepare for it. She did not desire it. It came without warning, sudden, sharp, like a veil being torn away from a truth too devastating to bear. One moment she was listening to Christ's sorrow-filled words. The next, a spiritual reality unfolded before her with the clarity of daylight. She writes that it was not a vision of heaven or hell as she had seen before. It was not filled with flames, nor angels, nor the usual symbols of divine revelation. What she witnessed was something far more subtle and far more terrifying. It was the moment of a soul's death. Teresa never revealed who this soul was. She offered no name, no lifetime details, not even a hint. She kept every earthly trace hidden, perhaps out of reverence, or perhaps because the identity did not matter. What mattered was the condition of the soul. All she discloses is that this soul had refused to forgive someone, sometime, for a wound that had cut deeply. During life, the soul believed its anger was justified. It carried its resentment like a shield, convinced it was protecting itself. It rehearsed the hurt, revisited the injury, allowed the bitterness to echo in the chambers of its memory. It considered its unforgiveness a form of justice, a way of keeping the wound visible and the offense acknowledged. But when death came, Teresa says, everything changed. She saw the soul suspended in a great darkness, yet this darkness did not surround it like an external punishment. It did not come from hell or demons or divine wrath. It was a darkness that radiated from within the soul itself, thick, suffocating, shaped by the bitterness it had carried throughout its life. Around the soul's heart she saw chains, not iron chains, not earthly metal, but something spiritual, something made of what she chillingly described as the hardened substance of remembered pain. These chains glowed with a cold, lifeless weight, as though every memory of hurt had solidified into an unbreakable bond. Every link in the chain was a moment of unforgiveness. Every knot was a refusal to show mercy. Every cold weight was a grudge the soul had chosen to nurture instead of surrender. And then Teresa witnessed the moment that left her trembling. The soul tried to rise. She saw it turn toward a faint, distant light, a light that represented the presence of God. The soul longed for that light with a desperation she could feel. It stretched toward it, strained toward it, pleaded silently for it. In that instant, all its excuses, all its justifications, all its earthly defenses vanished. It wanted God and God alone. But the chain held firm. Teresa watched the soul attempt to lift itself, only to be yanked downward by the weight bound to its own heart. The soul struggled again, desperately, frantically, but each attempt only revealed the terrible truth. It was not free. And then came the moment she could barely describe. The soul fell. She says it fell with a swiftness that made her gasp, like a stone hurled from a great height. There were no demons dragging it, no divine hand pushing it away, no external force acting upon it at all. The soul was held, imprisoned, and ultimately pulled downward by one thing: its own unforgiveness. When Christ had told her, "The soul that refuses to forgive binds itself," she had understood the words. But now, seeing this, she understood the reality. She felt as though her own heart were wrapped in iron. The weight of it pressed upon her so intensely that she could not speak for hours afterward. She wept, not simply because of the tragedy of the soul she saw, but because she realized how casually people treat resentment, how lightly they hold on to grudges, how confidently they justify their bitterness. She saw now that unforgiveness is not merely a spiritual weakness. It is a deadly poison, one that transforms the interior of the soul and shapes its eternal trajectory. Christ's warning became painfully clear to her. A heart that clings to resentment cannot rise. It collapses under the weight of its own hardness. The pain it refuses to release becomes the very prison that traps it. This was the horror Christ wanted Teresa to witness. Not the dominion of demons, not the wrath of God, but the tragic reality of a soul destroying itself. And as the vision faded, Teresa felt the sorrow of Christ's earlier words echoing through her being. Mercy cannot enter where hatred remains. What Christ showed her next would deepen this fear and reveal why the moment of death is far more decisive than most people imagine. Teresa, shaken to her core by what she had witnessed, fell to her knees and wept. She begged Christ with a trembling voice to explain how something so ordinary, so human, so seemingly small as holding on to hurt could lead to a consequence so catastrophic. She could not reconcile it. How could an everyday wound, something people carry so casually, become a chain strong enough to drag a soul away from God Himself? Christ, in a tenderness that pierced deeper than any rebuke, began to speak to her, but His words were not soft. She says they were a fire that engraved itself upon my soul. They burned away excuses, illusions, and the tiny self-defenses the human heart builds around its pain. He told her something she had never fully understood. Forgiveness is not an optional virtue. It is the very architecture of heaven. Christ revealed that forgiveness is not merely an act of kindness toward another person. It is not simply moral goodness or a virtuous gesture. Forgiveness shapes the soul. It stretches it. It transforms it. It prepares it for divine life. "Daughter," Christ said, "mercy is the atmosphere of heaven. It is the light the saints live in. It is the very air they breathe." This truth, Teresa writes, stunned her. She had always known forgiveness was important, but she had never considered it as something ontological, something that changes what the soul is, what the soul becomes. Christ continued, "Every time a soul forgives, even when forgiveness costs them tears, even when the wound is deep and the hurt feels undeserved, the soul becomes more capable of receiving my love." He showed her that forgiveness is not losing something, it is enlarging something. Every act of mercy expands the heart a little more. Every release of resentment makes room for grace. Every surrender of bitterness causes the walls of the heart to widen, to soften, to open. Each time the soul chooses mercy, it becomes more like God, who pours mercy endlessly. But then Christ revealed the darker side of that truth. He told her that every refusal to forgive shrinks the heart. Even if the refusal feels justified, even if the injury was real, even if the wound was deep. Unforgiveness hardens the inner core of the soul, the way exposure hardens clay. Christ said, "A heart that clings to anger becomes small. It cannot stretch, it cannot breathe, it closes its doors to my grace." Teresa suddenly understood the spiritual danger hidden in resentment. She had always seen it as a struggle, a temptation, a human weakness. Now she saw it as spiritual deformation, a distortion of the soul's very shape. And then Christ explained something that left her silent with fear. "In the first moment after death," he told her, "the soul is drawn toward me with a longing deeper than all earthly loves combined. It rushes toward my light because it was created for me. But to enter my presence, the soul must expand. It must be able to open infinitely." Heaven, Teresa realized, is not simply a place. It is a state of total openness, total vulnerability, total receptivity to divine love. A soul must be wide, spacious, free, capable of stretching into eternity. But a heart burdened by resentment cannot stretch. It contracts, it stiffens, it recoils from divine love, because it has become too rigid to receive it. Christ showed her that unforgiveness is not a chain imposed from outside. It is a chain the soul forges with its own will, a chain that prevents the soul from opening, a chain that makes the presence of God unbearable. The soul is not pushed away by God. It is pulled downward by its own hardness. In that moment, Teresa understood the full divine logic behind forgiveness. Heaven is a world of pure mercy, a realm where no bitterness exists, a place where love circulates without obstruction, where nothing, no memory, no injustice, no wound, is held against another. "Anyone who refuses to forgive," Christ said, "rejects the very substance of heaven." To cling to resentment is to cling to something that does not exist in God, and nothing that is not found in God can enter his kingdom. Teresa writes that this truth overwhelmed her. She saw how unforgiveness is not a moral misstep. It is a spiritual rejection of what heaven is. A soul that chooses not to forgive is choosing, at its deepest level, not to live in the reality of heaven. As the weight of this revelation settled into her heart, she realized that Christ was not warning her out of anger. He was warning her out of heartbreak. A heartbreak she had glimpsed in his eyes earlier. The sorrow of watching souls imprison themselves by refusing the mercy he longs to give. This was the divine logic. Forgiveness is not simply a command, it is preparation for eternity. Without it, the soul cannot survive the radiance of God. And what Christ revealed next would show Teresa just how terrifying that radiance can be for a heart unwilling to forgive. This vision haunted Teresa more deeply than any encounter she ever had with demons, purgatorial suffering, or images of hell's torments. Hell terrified her, yes, but this revelation unsettled her in a different and far more intimate way. Hell shows what becomes of a soul that chooses darkness, but this vision showed something far more frightening, how close even a seemingly devout soul can drift toward ruin without ever noticing. It revealed to her how thin the line truly is between grace and disaster, how fragile the soul becomes when it forgets mercy, and how a fall rarely begins with a dramatic rebellion. More often, she realized, it begins in silence. It begins with a small closing of the heart, almost unnoticeable, repeated 1,000 times until the soul no longer remembers how to open itself at all. This shook her to her core. Teresa admitted later that after this vision, she examined her soul with a fear that she had never felt before. It was not the fear of God's punishment. She knew well that God was merciful. It was fear of herself, a fear of what she was capable of becoming if she ever stopped fighting her interior battles, a fear of the potential hardness hidden within her, like a seed waiting for the right conditions to sprout. She saw her own soul with a harsh and piercing clarity. She realized how many times she had held on to injury because she felt justified, how many small slights she had quietly stored in the corners of her memory, how often she allowed pride to whisper, "I have a right to feel this way. I was wronged. I deserve better." The recognition humbled her so deeply that she wept. She did not weep out of shame, but out of an overwhelming awareness of her own weakness, her own capacity to forget mercy, her vulnerability to bitterness and pride in the daily frictions of community life. She saw that the danger was not in great temptations or dramatic falls, but in the ordinary moments, moments when she allowed herself to dwell on a hurt rather than forgive, to judge rather than understand, to defend her dignity rather than imitate Christ. From that day forward, she began begging Christ with a new determination, "Uproot even the smallest seed of resentment within me." She asked him that whenever she felt wounded, even slightly, he would remind her of the vision, the chain, the weight of the soul falling like a stone into the depths from which it could no longer rise. Every time she felt the first flicker of irritation, every time pride attempted to defend her ego, she asked him to place before her eyes the soul she had seen descending helplessly. Teresa's fear did not paralyze her. It transformed her. Something changed in her way of reacting. Her sisters noticed it quickly. She became, as they later testified, almost incapable of holding grudges. She forgave with a speed and fullness that astonished everyone around her. The injuries that once would have lingered in her thoughts vanished like smoke. She embraced insults, misunderstandings, and criticisms as precious opportunities to imitate Christ. She said often that she would rather suffer 1,000 injustices than allow even one corner of her heart to grow cold or hardened. She became gentler, more patient, more tender, not because she felt stronger, she felt weaker than ever, but because she now relied more completely on grace. Yet her greatest fear was not for herself. It was for others, especially those who carried old wounds, those who nurtured bitterness, those who held on to grudges as though they were treasures instead of chains. Teresa saw with immense sorrow how common this spiritual danger is, how often people live years, even decades, with unresolved resentments, how easily bitterness becomes part of someone's identity, how people justify their unforgiveness with stories they retell so often they no longer realize they've become enslaved to them. She understood now why Christ had shown her such a vision, not to frighten her, but to awaken her, and through her, to awaken many others. She warned her sisters, with a seriousness bordering on urgency, that unforgiveness is among the most underestimated sins in the world, not because it is loud or dramatic, but because it is subtle. It grows in silence. It hardens slowly. It disguises itself as righteousness or self-protection. It convinces the soul that holding on to hurt is a form of justice, when in truth it is a quiet decay. And then, one day, the soul stands before God and discovers something terrible. It has no strength to rise. Not because God refuses to lift it, but because the heart has grown so heavy, so closed, so hardened by years of resentment that grace cannot enter unless the soul chooses to open itself, and it no longer remembers how. This was the fear Teresa carried. Not a fear that led to despair, but a fear that led to vigilance. A fear that reminded her every moment. The heart must remain soft, for a soft heart rises easily. A hardened heart sinks under its own weight. And in this fear, she discovered the beginning of true holiness. Teresa's vision is not a relic of the past. It is a message for our time, perhaps more urgently than ever. We live in a world saturated with resentment. Wounds are shared openly. Grievances are nurtured publicly. People define themselves by their injuries, by what was done to them, by the apologies they never received. But Christ revealed to Teresa what this path leads to. A heart that clings to wounds becomes a prison for itself. The grudges we hold now can become the chains that bind us later. The resentments we feed today can become the weights that drag us downward in the first moments after death. This is not meant to frighten, but to awaken. If we understood what Teresa saw, the soul trying to rise but unable to move, we would forgive with urgency. We would run to mercy as if running for air. We would refuse to sleep before making peace with others. We would release bitterness the moment it appears, knowing how quickly it turns into iron. Even our smallest resentments matter. Even our quiet grudges matter. They shape the soul in ways we do not see. They mold us either in the image of Christ or in the image of our wounds. To forgive is to choose freedom. To forgive is to choose heaven. To forgive is to choose to resemble Christ. Christ's warning to Teresa is clear. A heart that refuses mercy cannot receive mercy, not because God withholds it, but because the soul has made itself incapable of holding it. This is the terrifying truth, one that can save us if we let it. So tonight, let the weight of this story settle into your soul. Let Teresa's vision become a mirror. Who stands in that mirror with you? Who carries your resentment? Whose memory causes your heart to tighten instead of open? Bring them to God now. Think of the grievances you have justified, the hurts you have repeated to yourself, the grudges you have kept as proof of how deeply you were wronged. These are not trophies. They are chains. Let Christ show you what Teresa saw, the soul struggling to rise, yet bound by its own hands. Forgiveness may not come easily. It may not come in a single moment, but the desire to forgive is already the beginning of freedom. Whisper that desire now. Offer the wound to Christ. Ask for the grace to let go. Ask for the grace to breathe mercy instead of bitterness. Pray for those who hurt you. Pray for those who never apologized. Pray for those who never understood the pain they caused. Your prayer does not excuse their actions. It frees your soul. And if this story has stirred something in your heart, something that calls you toward mercy, something that invites you to let go of old pain, do not ignore it. It is Christ calling you to freedom. Walk with us in these reflections. Pray with us. Learn with us. And let us together seek the mercy that saves, heals, and rebuilds even the hardest of hearts. May Saint Teresa of Jesus intercede for us. May Christ break every chain of bitterness within us. And may his mercy prepare our hearts to rise without burden when our final hour comes.